Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Today I would like to introduce you perhaps to a Scottish writer named James Kelman. James Kelman was born in 1946 and he's still alive and kicking. And the reason I want to say a couple of words about him today is because he presents us with a really sort of real problem in some ways, which is, what is literature? Can one write in any way possible, at least in a very, very sort of non-literary way, and still be literature? In fact, how does one define what is a literary way? And there is another reason why James Kelman is interesting to think about, is that typically what he writes about is a certain population in a certain part of the world. And really the question for people like us, who may not come from that part of the world, is, well, who's legitimate in talking for those people, and does what James Kelman do, for example, really represent those people that he takes as, let's say, main focus of his writing in general? Now, James Kelman has written both novels and short stories, and a little bit of non-fiction as well. Among the novels, I'll only mention a few. The first one, A Chancer from 1985. The breakthrough novel, I guess you could call it, How Late It Was, How Late, that won the Booker Prize. We'll come back to that in a second. A book that I thought was very interesting also because I love the title. It's called You Have to Be Careful in the Land of the Free. That's 2004. And one that is very pertinent to our discussion, I guess, is Kieran Smith, Boy, from 2008. There's been some novels since. Some short fiction that also made him a real voice when they came out is the first one. I think it's not the Gyro from 83. There's Greyhound for Breakfast, a great collection from 87. That also won a prize. And If It Is Your Life, I think, is the latest one from 2010. Now, why is James Kelman interesting? Well, if you don't know him, if you've never read him, and the chances are, because he is not one of those best-selling authors, I would say, the chances are that you've not come across his writing to date. James Kelman won, as I said, the Booker Prize in '94, and there was great opposition to his winning that prize. Now, why? Because the language that James Kelman uses in that book particularly, and in all those short stories and novels, certainly in the 80s, 90s, is a language that is supposedly at least coming from, let's say, the working class or the unemployed on the streets of typically Glasgow in Scotland, in Europe, obviously. So what does that mean? Well, if you want to reproduce the speech of the, say, uneducated, typically, and most of them are relatively uneducated, and of the unemployed, not the criminal class at all, just the normal, regular people, well, you have to try and approximate the way they speak. And the way they speak typically will be not flowery. They won't be loads of beautiful adjectives and evocative adverbs. Choice of verbs will be more limited. And a lot of swearing, in fact, as the case may be. So that opposition to him winning the Booker Prize, and the Booker Prize, if you don't know, is the most prestigious literary prize in England, whatever that means, of course, in terms of the quality of the books that are chosen. But certainly the opposition in '94, when How Late It Was, How Late won the Booker Prize, the opposition was, well, how on earth can you give a literary prize, the most important literary prize, to a book that basically uses the F word every other word, as somebody put it at the time? That was a bit of an exaggeration, of course, but indeed, in How Late It Was, How Late, there is a lot of swearing. Now, that is, of course, what is very interesting to us readers. What is style? What is, in fact, beauty? Perhaps you grew up like me having the idea that literature was some sort of beautiful type of writing, that real literature was, of course, it was meaningful, whatever that meant, but it was also, really well written, really beautiful. Now, we didn't perhaps know then about, I don't know, Hemingway, who's not particularly striking stylist in terms of chiseling of sentences. But we certainly understood, of course, that, I don't know, there was something special about the way those people wrote, right? They knew, I don't know, a lot of words and they made beautiful sentences. And of course, if you are into that category of people who really care about the beauty of sentences, then you are much more likely to go and read I don't know, early novels of John Banville, the Irish writer, or John Updike, of course, the American stylist, people like that, than you are to reading, I don't know, a run-of-the-mill type of mediocre, done-in-a-week novel. No, fine. The reality, of course, is that literature cannot be summed up simply by questions of style. You may, in fact, there have been many, you may write a book in a beautiful style, but the book needs to have substance as well. As we do understand, style also has a way of sometimes putting people off if it's a bit difficult to follow, or it's really over ornate, sort of 19th century, late 19th century type of writing, for example, which can be kind of bombastic and too ornate, difficult to read now these days, very, very complex, very, very long sentences, very, very long paragraphs. You, of course, can always have a look at Henry James. If you don't know him, Henry James was the epitome of sort of idea writing. I'm not sure it has aged very, very well. So what is beauty? What is style when it comes to fiction? James Kelman exemplifies that, simply because the question then turns into, well, what is literature? Is James Kelman literature? Can that be literature? Can it be literature not only in terms of the language, again, sort of sparse, very direct, short sentences, loads of swearing, relatively limited range of expression, but on top of it, of course, who he talks about or who narrates, who are the characters of those novels and short stories. And that, of course, is a related question, and that is who can write about whom, and who has a sort of legitimacy to talk about whom. Here, typically, as I said, James Kelman goes in a school of sort of the Salman Rushdie school, which is, as you probably know, that Salman Rushdie one day, as the story goes, of course, Rushdie thought one day, I'm reading all those books about India and I never hear Indian voices. What I hear is the voice of the white European, typically writer, writing about India, but not the Indian voices. And that, he said somewhere, was the reason he started to write in his very, very original, very particular, idiosyncratic style, trying to emulate the voices of the Indian people he knew or had come across. And that is what James Kelman here does. He gives a voice to the voiceless, as is often said. He gives a voice that is a means of representation, a means of expression to those who are typically completely ignored and hardly ever represented. Very few people aspire to be unemployed. Very few people aspire to be poor. Very few people aspire to have to beg for a cigarette or for a pint in a pub. And so typically, of course, those people are not very much given a voice to express themselves. So here, style, the way it is written, becomes an echo of a reality, not only a linguistic reality, but a sort of cultural, societal reality. A related question when it comes to works like this, of course, is, well, what would it be like to talk about those people and describe their life in a very ornate, very well-written, very fluent language? And here, if you ask that question, you may immediately think that there might be friction enough here for the experience to become a little bit uncomfortable. So this is a very interesting question that James Kelman really is at the center of, is who has the legitimacy to talk about either situations or peoples, and in what way one should talk about one particular people, one particular situation. Should one use the voice of those who are being talked about, or can you talk about those people in your own voice? Ultimately, that becomes a problem in the sense, of course, of having people judge your work on the simple basis of the way it looks, that is the language that you use, neglecting the simple fact, really, that a style is also symbolic of meaning. A style carries meaning as well. If you think about the absolutely wonderful novels, it certainly comes to me, of Edward St. Aubyn, is Patrick Melrose mind-blowing novels. Like if you look at the first one, for example, the style is very clearly used as symbolically meaningful about the characters and who they are, the way they speak, the way they exchange dialogues. It had to be, in a way, in that style. It would have been really, really weird to write it in a different way. They are brilliant novels, and again, reminding us that style is very much part of the meaning of the novel. So, giving a voice to the voiceless is a great intention. Of course, since The Angry Young Man in England have mid-20th century, that has been, of course, a goal of many writers to give a voice to the voiceless. And James Kelman is very much in that school, but there are added elements to it that make him especially interesting, I think. A last point about James Kelman that I think is very relevant to us as readers, and relevant about asking ourselves, what are good books? How do we know that a book is good? What makes a good book, or a book good? Is that James Kelman wrote some non-fiction where he was very clear about the fact that for him, a great writer has got to be a great human being. Now, what that means really is that if you've been, for example, like the French writer Céline, Louis Ferdinand Céline. Céline was put in jail at the end of the Second World War for being a collaborator and a Nazi supporter. And he wrote extremely violent anti-Semitic pamphlets and writings in general, like extremely violent. So anyway, Céline now has found himself since, for the last 70 years really, 80 years even, has found himself in this very particular position of, on the one hand, being an anti-Semitic Nazi supporter who was, in fact, was sentenced to death, and then the sentence was commuted into imprisonment. And at the same time, Céline, if you don't know him, is considered to be one of the most important writers in French literature in the 20th century, because during the First World War and in the years following that, he produced writing which carry no trace of anti-Semitism, but which were revolutionary, really, in a way, for French letters. So one of Céline's most famous novel, for example, is still considered to be a monument of French literature. It carries no traces of what Céline will be later on during the Second World War, and we have this dichotomy between Céline the man and Céline the writer. For James Kelman, it is impossible to have such a dichotomy. In order to be a great writer, you must be a great human being. What is a great human being? Well, that's where the problem comes in, of course, defining what a great human being is. James Kelman is a humanist, of course. That is, he's very much on the side of supportive of, appreciative of the working class, if we want to put it in a very, very simplified and a bit stupid way. And so, of course, to be a great human being, you have to have the qualities of, looking for equality, for example, which are obviously not always exhibited by great writers, certainly when you go back in time. That is very interesting because it reminds us of what we've just said about what is literature, and can great literature be written by somebody, a person who is a bad person, however you define that, of course. There were accusations thrown at Voltaire, the great 18th century writer, because supposedly, I'm not sure that's true, but supposedly he held shares in a company that was trading in the slaves. Now, the question, as we all know, because we have been exposed to those questions repeatedly over the last few years, is what to do in cases of great writers who, as people, may have done or did do things that are wrong or that were wrong today. That is the way we look at it today, of course. Now, Céline is a different case. Anti-Semitism is a terrible thing now and yesterday. When it comes to historical figures like Voltaire, for example, it becomes much, much more difficult, of course, because we have to remind ourselves that we do not think the way they thought and we do not see the world the way they did. James Kelman, by tackling typically, again, not always, but typically working class, disenfranchised people on the streets of Glasgow, is making a stand, both literary and social. But beyond that, I have to say a word on this. Those stories and those early novels certainly are incredible for their evocative quality, and incredible in a sense that you realized that with a little bit, in terms of language, in terms of plotting, in terms of setting, with a little bit you can achieve incredible perceptive writing. And that is why ultimately James Kelman, while being very interesting as a case study about what is literature and what can become literature, is still fascinating as a writer, properly speaking. That is, as somebody who writes fiction, and whether that fiction is very close to reality, imitative of reality, or detached from it, in the last resort, we have to ask, what is the worth of those novels? What is the worth of those short stories? And if you read short stories like The Burn, for example, or A Disaffection, or How Late It Was, How Late, those are great texts because they carry you to a world that you may know nothing about, but they carry you in your mind and in the heart. Some of those stories are just heartbreaking, and yet he achieves all that with, again, on purpose, of course, very limited means. And that reminds us, finally, that heart, feelings, emotions, they may be described, or they may be felt, or they may be represented differently across all layers of society. But one thing is certain, that whoever we are, at whichever level of that society, of our society we have, all of us, strong feelings, we have heartbreak, we have hopes, we have fears. And James Kelman is one of those people who can lay bare those very human things in an environment that perhaps doesn't seem conducive to it, in a language that doesn't seem conducive to it, and yet he manages to do that brilliantly. So for all those reasons, I can only encourage you to go out and grab yourself a James Kelman. Do have a look at the blurb and at the date of publication. Kieran Boy, for example, as I said, from 2006 maybe, is a markedly difficult book because it sort of puts itself in the shoes of a boy who has difficulties growing up. So it's not easy to read. But if you go again to those early novels from the 90s or the short stories from the 80s and the 90s, you will hopefully discover a very new way to express humanity that is hardly ever seen and yet fully deserves your attention. Thank you.